Berea, and I am an interdisciplinary scientist by definition. I have 2 PhDs, one in economics and one in computational social science. And I've worked on a multitude of research problems, usually at the intersection between economic and social systems and computational techniques and complex systems, such as nonlinear dynamic phenomena, chaos theory, emergence problems, and in general anything that is related to complex systems and complexity theory. The research that I'm going to present today is a research I've been interested in for a while now, on the emergence of communication. And when I'm talking about the emergence of communication, I'm not necessarily talking about communications in human, between us in humans, but mostly about, okay, how did communication emerge from cells to societies? And I will start this presentation now. I'm sharing my screen, my desktop, and I am hoping that you can now see this presentation. And okay, if I can only move, just 1 second, if I can move the video a little bit. Okay. So I hope you can again see my desktop. When I started this research, it was a while back with a grant from the National Academy of Sciences. And I had 3 actually grad students that were working with me originally. That was Marta Hansen and Ruchika Sapalkar. And this was a joint program, or a program research that I wanted to span several universities. I didn't want it to be hosted just by one university. So I managed to make it a little bit inter-universitary, if there's such a word, by pulling together students from different campuses. And the premise for this research, so the fundamental question that that I arrived at, or that has been that became clear to me was after a conference or a workshop that we had at the National Academy of Sciences. And the underlying fundamental question was at that particular conference is, how do we transition from 1 to 2 individuals, or how do pairs form in living systems? Why do 2 cells start to communicate, or why do they become pairwise? And that's this is even a more fundamental problem in network science. In network science, we don't really know how pairs form. We know that we have dyads and triads, and we know there are only 16 types of structures that we can have between any 3 nodes in the living systems and in the non-living systems as well. Therefore, this is a very, very fundamental property of our world. And the idea is the same here. How do we arrive to at collective behavior, whether this is a group, a company, a country, or any type of collective behavior, from 1 individual to individuals? How do we scale up? So how does this scalability, how is it achieved? And the theoretical proposition that I had here was that we achieve that basically through communication. Cells communicate with each other, organisms communicate with each other, and humans communicate with each other. Humans communicate with computers, and computers communicate with each other. So communication is one of those versatile processes that it is a heterogeneous process, while the agents are heterogeneous as well. So this is another property of complex systems, right? And at the same time, is as adaptive and as evolving as these agents are. So in other words, we know that languages arise, or that they are being modified within communities, or that they are evolving with the communities where they are. And it's the same with the types of signals, right? With the chemical signals, they are very embedded in the types of cellular systems or in the types of organisms or organs and the way they communicate. So I developed both a theoretical, a mathematical model, and a computational model that includes these properties of heterogeneity and also the subjectivity of information. Because when we are talking about exchange of information, that particular information is not the same for any two organisms. From let's say, just to give a very rudimentary example, when I say that this particular color is green, you might perceive a different shade of green than I do, or you might be able perceive even a shade of blue, right? So any type of information is very contextual and subjective. That is also true even for chemical systems or chemical communication. I created basically a model of communication or of information exchange where we can adapt it either to cells interaction, to organisms or animal signaling, to human languages, and to human and computer interactions. And what I was looking for in this particular model was to see whether there are any differences between the organisms or the cells that have the ability to change the rules by which they exchange the information. So they have some sort of a, let's say, proxy decision rule by which they act and behave, versus the organisms that only react to information stimuli, right? And in order to build this model, I applied a little bit of a reverse methodology. So in general, in economics and social science, we are using or we are borrowing many methods and many theories and ideas that have been developed before in biology and physics about, let's say, experiments, about how we do hypothesis testing and all that. But also economics and social science have developed some methodologies that are unique to the social systems and to the economic systems. So these methods, maybe they are more suitable, or maybe they can reveal something new to us with respect to how collectives or how this information is being exchanged, because sociality and coordination are definitely properties of communication, or they go hand in hand basically, right? So what if we reverse this methodology and we borrowed methods from, let's say, economics of information, or from barter and trust and reputation type of research, or the economics of pairwise exchange, and we look at using those methods, we look into biological and social systems, and particularly in biological and social networks, can we reveal something new? So the underlying theme here is that, okay, what is the difference between biological and social in pairwise interactions? We know that there are so many organisms that are social, from insects to dolphins definitely have developed. Some researchers say that they have their own language. And how do we achieve all the way from cells interaction to even plants that communicate with each other? Then we have developed the more complex and more unique human languages, which we don't find anywhere else just yet, right? And how can we model communication emergence in a way that we can actually start by saying that two entities that might be similar or might be different but have no common language just yet, how do they start communicating or interacting with each other? What's that underlying fundamental property that can allow for us to actually start understanding each other and draw a meaning that is common, let's say, from two memes or two concepts that are very differently embedded into different systems, right? In order to develop this theory and model, I started, okay, let's go back to the roots, right, to the very fundamentals. And we know from computer science, communication science, social science, biology, all these fields model the information exchange or the information transmission the same way. There is a sender, there is a receiver, and between them there is a message, right? But what we know from the economics of information, which I didn't find in any other fields, particularly with respect to the heterogeneity and subjectivity in information exchange, is that a message can be an association of memes, so it's not just one message that is the same for both the sender and the receiver, that both the sender and the receiver have or can be modeled as two different ontological maps, right? We are like, let's say, walking associations of concepts or walking associations of memes, and we know cells also differ from each other by their chemical signatures. But at the same time, there are constraints both for the sender and for receiver with respect to the information they possess or the information they exchange, and also incentives with respect to the information they possess and the information they exchange. So if we implement this idea of incentives and constraints in the way the sender understands the meaning of this particular message, and also different incentives and constraints which are specific to the receiver for the same message, then we have different meanings that are being transmitted through the same message. So if we model information as an economic good, we know that it can be subjective, right? From the same idea or the same phrase, we can understand two different things just because we are two different individuals. It can be heterogeneous. Also, it is a process. Information is not good or something tangible, but it is more of a flow of a process. Specifically when it comes to the economics of information, we know that it's non-rivalrous. So this is an economic property, meaning that you can give the information and also keep it. So unlike any other goods in economics, once you give it up or trade it, it doesn't mean that you don't own it anymore. And at the same time, it's non-excludable, meaning that once it's out there, you cannot take it back, right? For instance, if I tell you, don't think about pink elephants, what are you going to think about? Pink elephants, right? If we are thinking about these properties these economic properties of information, then we can adjust the original model that came from Claude Shannon, right, about the information exchange, which is the fundamental model that all information theory is using today with respect to quantifying information in zeros and ones, right, in bits. But if we are applying, let's say, these economic properties of information to that model, what do we understand? What can we find, right? So in this particular model, in our model that we developed, we have as agents, let's say we have 2 or 3 agents that are ontological networks, right? We are, like I said, we are bags of ideas and concepts walking maps, walking associations. For starters, let's have them identical in topology. We are both starting with the clean slates or the with the same, let's say, genetic markup, and this can be any 2 organisms or any 2 cells, right? So these are proxies for individuals of the same species. So in this particular case, in this diagram, we can see, okay, if I have an association of concepts A, B, C, D, and E, and F, and I want to exchange just a subset or a subgraph of this, which is F, to my peer, which has another ontological concept made of G, H, and I, then his ontological concept or map is going to become F, G, H, and I, right? And as rules of behavior in this model is that agents produce, consume, and exchange information. So again, these economic ideas or economic flavor with respect to information as being a product or consumption or exchange. The agents can be either stationary, they just receive information like we are doing now, right? We are not particularly doing anything, just sitting here and exchanging information with each other. Or there is an added searching cost, right? If I am particularly interested in theory, let's say in relativity theory, then I would have to search for it and to access it. Now it's easier to access it, but let's say 20 years ago, I had to go to the library and look for the book and maybe buy the book. So there is an added search cost for it. A search cost which is not a monetary search cost, but it's a search cost that it's movement in space kind of cost, or a different type of cost, an energetic cost, let's say, for the organisms and for the cells, right? And then, of course, there is a lot of interaction with a static environment, right? We are always looking out the window and we are observing what's going on around us. So that's a type of information that comes into our ontological maps as well, if we pay attention to it. If not, then it's not important, right? We don't associate any meaning to it, but it happens many times that we just stumble upon information that might be relevant for us or not. And then there is a process of selection, meaning that we have heterogeneous benefits and costs for both the signaler and the receiver. And from the economic standpoint, the signaler is the producer of information and the receiver is the consumer of information. And we also have a process of adaptation where information may be forgotten or may be strengthened. The information that we use mostly is the one that is going to be strengthened. The one that we don't use that often is going to be forgotten. And there are so many cases of people who speak foreign languages, but if they don't speak it for many years, they forget it, right? So these are also, in this model, I model them as proxies for both physical and cognitive memories, because we also suffer from physical decay. So in a nutshell, the model looks like, okay, I have a network that produces new information, that acquires or can acquire new information from a peer network, and then that there are processes of adaptation of memory strengthening and decay. Yeah? And I will actually demo the model in a few minutes. And there are several types of way in which your communication can happen. It can happen either just pairwise. You just have two organisms that are communicating with each other. So it's network-to-network communication, or you have two computers communicating with each other endlessly, or two people, or two cells. But you can also have a one-to-many type of communication where this one organism just receives a lot of information from the environment. You can have a random choice between 1 and 2. You either communicate with a peer, so it's dynamic, or with a static environment, or it can be selective, meaning that any of the organisms actually make a decision about what type of information they produce and they consume, what type of information they send and they acquire, and the decision choice is based on an expected net benefit. And this idea of expected net benefit, again, comes from economics as an idea of valuation. How do I value, or how do I put quantitative understanding or something that I can model with respect to the meaning of information. And again, economic theory tells us that it's this idea of benefit. If something interests me or has meaning for me, then the benefit of it is higher for me. If the cost of acquiring it is higher than the benefit, then even if it's meaningful, I might not get it. On another hand, again, if I'm not interested in this information, if it's just noise for me, then the benefit of it is zero. And even if the cost of acquiring it is zero, it still doesn't mean anything to me. It's just noise. It just passes. There is an expression, goes through one ear and goes through the other out, right? When it comes to making a decision about who you are communicating with, either another network or organism or the environment, just observing the environment or like for instance, reading a book, the expected benefit sometimes can be erroneously estimated ex ante. You have an idea whether this information is going to be good for you, or that you are interested in, but at the same time, it can be a mismanagement or a mismatch. And John actually told me a while back, and I found that idea very, very interesting, that you can find this idea of erroneous expecting net benefit in cell communication as well, when there are some biases in cells communicating with each other. So there are, of course, some mathematical rules behind the model. So we start with random networks that are Erdős-Rényi type of networks of memes. And this means that they are initialized with the same probability of connection, that the information that is exchanged is just copied, as is a copy of a subnetwork that is being integrated into the other network, that there is each subnetwork of memes has a benefit and a cost, and the ratio as the ratio of the memes or the links of the subnetwork. The receiving network incorporates the new memes with the same probability of connection. The receiving network adds a search cost, but the search cost can be, so it's parameterized, so we can explore scenarios whether we have a higher search cost or maybe a search cost that is zero, which means that basically it's just you're just sitting and information comes to you, right? And then we have the memory strengthening idea, which is modeled by from neuroscience, which is the forgetting curve, which was discovered actually by Ebbinghaus all the way back in 1885, and it still stands as a good rule for forgetting in neuroscience. And it's very similar to a power law distribution, right? Where again you progressively start to forget, and you forget more and more and more what you don't what you don't use. And then there is a physical decay, which in this model I used it as a DNA, as the DNA half-life decay, where particularly it means that you can select the memes are being selected, the memes with the weakest links are being discarded. And I want to actually give a demo of the model instead of just talking over it. So for instance, here, right, we have 3 networks. Let's just select for now just 2, right? So we have 2 networks that are random networks. Concepts of memes have the same probability of connection. I can actually select here how many concepts I want. It's normalized between 0 and 100. And I can also select the probability of connection. I can select a lower probability, right? I have, let's say, looser concepts connected with each other. I don't know exactly how this works in neuroscience, because I don't think there are actually, there is actually research on how these memes are associated in the brain. So it's a little bit of a black box, but we can model all the possible ways in which this can be connected, right? And we can have a search cost that can be, again, some value or 0, right? We can get it all the way to 0. And then we have 4 types of communication methods that I was mentioning to you. Either just send and receive, meaning that I have the 2 networks just communicating with each other. And let's see what happens. I can tweak on and off the forgetting of the memes or the strengthening. So I can have no adaptation and no selection, right? And I can have the model run. And what happens here, I get the concepts that are triangular are the concepts that are being exchanged, right? And what I am tracking is the net benefit of information, so it's the benefit minus the cost, and also how much language or how many of these memes are being communicated. And I can play with all these scenarios. So let's say, for instance, just when they are communicating, they are not communicating with each other, but just with the environment, right? And again, I get 0 benefit of information, net benefit of information in this case. But let's see what happens, for instance, when we switch on these adaptation and selection mechanisms, right? And what happens is very interesting, is that we have usually one network that grows and communicates more, and the other one that survives, and we have more net benefit of information for one network and less for the other. So there are many scenarios that we can look at here with different types of communication scenarios. And this one in particular, the selective method of communication, what showed, and I'll show you in a minute, is that it's the one that closest resembles natural language. So in this particular agent-based model that is built here, we can do a parameter sweep. And then in a parameter sweep means that we can select all possible combinations of the parameters and then analyze the results. And the results, the results look like this. So we have a typical model behavior where we can track the communicated memes, and we can see clearly that when we have scenarios where we have selection and adaptation, meaning that we have decay and memory strengthening, memory decay and memory strengthening, are the ones that are more interesting, or where we have behavior that is closer to what happens in real life, let's say in genes communicating with each other. While if we have no adaptation and no memory strengthening, it looks more like just a lot of noise that grows, and which means that you can have like two computers talking to each other ad infinitum without getting any meaning out of it. And I also tracked the costs and benefits of this information exchange, and again, we have mostly zero benefit when, let's say, we have the Robinson Crusoe kind of scenario where the communication happens only with the environment, so you have no peer that you are talking to. While the more interesting behavior is when you have selective type of communication or just send and receive type of communication. And of course, you can scale up to 3 networks, so that's a possibility to see whether pairwise interactions versus free network interactions, if there are any differences over there, and we didn't observe actually any differences in scaling up. So if we are going all the way to the final results of these simulations, so we ran more than 5 million simulations for this, and always, absolutely always, when it comes to how much information is being communicated by each network, we have the selective method of communication where there is that decision rule based on that expected net benefit, even if it can be erroneous sometimes, is the one that renders most communication in the system. At the same time, when it comes to most ontology in the system, meaning that you have both the memes that are being communicating, but also you add to that the evolution of the individual ontological maps of the networks, then again, it's clearly the selective method of communication that renders for any of the 2 or 3 networks, that renders the highest range of the data, meaning the highest mean and the highest variance in the data. And the same when it comes to the net benefit of communication, either for each network or for the entire system, it's always the selective method of communication. And when it comes to the life cycle of communication, meaning for how long do these networks live, again, they live longer when they communicate selectively. And also, of course, when we scale up from 2 networks to 3 networks, and I apologize if you hear some noise. So when you scale up from 2 networks to 3 networks, again, you have more communication and more ontology. But what the most interesting thing is that when it comes to validating this with the Zipf law, and the Zipf law, we know that it's a power law with the power of -1, and we know that that approximates natural language. Again, only the selective type of communication gives us this Zipf law, and the other types of communication or any other scenarios do not. So again, some other variations on this simulation is whether it's sensitive to the initial conditions, meaning that does it matter which is the network that starts communicating first? And actually it does not. It only matters just a little bit for which network is going to live longer and which not. And the network that is going to live longer is the one that starts communicating, but it just, the difference is very, very, very small. And I'll skip some of these other results to some final conclusions and some validations with some genetic data or morphogenesis data. And we can say basically that, that the model is not sensitive to the quantity of information or the search cost or the probability of connection. So all those parameters that we can switch and sweep in so many ways, we cannot link them to the final results, meaning that the results are robust, right, to the initial conditions. At the same time, the model is sensitive to the idea of meaning or subjectivity, which is basically the net benefit of information, and to the lifetime of the networks. And these results hold in the free network scenarios as well. And we did some validations of the agent-based model. So in molecular biology, I looked in molecular biology at this substance which is called CAMP, which is the substance that stands for signaling in genes, is basically the molecule that controls for the aggregation or the communication of how cells aggregate and how the extracellular CAMP also helps genes to exchange in a transcriptional cascade, and how they can differentiate, and how you can get even to morphogenesis in cells. Right? So there is cell movement and cell type-specific gene expression, which are being regulated by the CAMP signal, and we have data about the CAMP. And this is the data of the CAMP signal that is basically drawn from this research in biology by Ranfar, Fuller, and Loomis about how the signal is being transmitted in genes, and it's very similar to, again, with the model that I developed. So the model A, it shows how much signal is being transmitted in the genes over time. Model A is in the wild, right? So it's in the natural world. Number B is in biological lab experiments, and C shows when you don't have any signaling conditions, and we can replicate that basically with the agent-based model. So again, when we have network-to-network communication with physical decay but no memory strengthening, it's the one that is closest to the type of signaling transmission in these genes. And we also looked at some data from the defects in gene mutations, and with the defects in gene mutations is that when you introduce an external signal, so when you have more signaling coming from, let's say, the environment, you restore the function of the cell, and you have more communication and more signaling happening in the system. And we achieved that in our model with, again, network to environment communication with physical decay but no memory strengthening, right? So it's in cell-to-cell communication. And also in morphogenesis, morphogenesis that is being restored by external signaling that mimics the internal signals, and we can achieve that with the most important, or what we found as the most interesting scenario, which is that one with the selective communication, where we have both physical decay and memory strengthening, right? So some conclusions from this research, basically proposing a new theoretical methodological exploration of information exchange in biology and social system by using some ideas from the economics of information, and that the selective communication, where there is a choice or a decision rule, leads to the most meaningful communication in the system, and the idea that subjectivity and survivability depend on the original conditions, I suspect there is a very close link between pairwise information exchange and morphogenesis in general. also the idea of activation, or how communication happens in time, right? The communication order is also very important. That's about it, what I have for now. What I intend to do at some point in the future is to explore some other types of network topologies. Also to look a little bit closer to this idea of the birth and the death of the networks, because at this point they just start, okay, as blank slates, and some of them die, but I don't really explore what if some other networks come in the system, so there is this life cycle of new and old networks coming in and out of the system. And also I'm looking for more quantitative validation, and hopefully from the human language data. So yeah, that's all I had for now, and thank you for listening, and please ask me questions.